Picture this. A woman walks into a German bakery in November 1923. She carries a wheelbarrow, not for groceries, but for money. Inside that wheelbarrow are stacks upon stacks of German marks, totaling 200 billion. Her purchase? A single loaf of bread. Children in the streets aren't playing with toys. They're building towers with bundles of banknotes because the paper money is worth less than kindling. Workers rush from their jobs not once, but twice a day to collect wages, sprinting to stores before their money becomes worthless in their pockets. How does a nation's currency become so worthless that people literally use it as wallpaper? How does money, the very foundation of civilization, transform from a symbol of value into children's playthings? Welcome back to Vaulted Wisdom, where we uncover the darkest chapters of financial history that the powerful would rather you forget. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of history's most catastrophic economic disasters, the Weimar Hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923. But before we begin this journey into monetary madness, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're building a community of truth seekers who understand that the past holds the keys to our future. And stick around until the end, because the parallels to today will shock you. Now, let's step into the chaos of post-war Germany, where money died and a nation's soul was shattered. November 11th, 1918. The guns fall silent across Europe. World War I is over, but for Germany, the real nightmare is just beginning. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a peace agreement. It was a financial death sentence. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, didn't just force Germany to accept blame for the war. It opened the floodgates to reparations so massive they defied comprehension. 132 billion gold marks. That's roughly $33 billion in 1921 money, or about $500 billion today. To put this in perspective, it was more than Germany's entire annual economic output. The Allies essentially demanded that Germany pay the equivalent of their entire economy, year after year, for decades. But here's what makes this truly diabolical. These payments had to be made in gold or foreign currency, not German marks. Germany couldn't simply print their way out of this debt, or so they thought. The German people were humiliated, broke, and desperate. The proud German Empire had been reduced to a republic governed by politicians who'd signed what many saw as a treaty of national suicide. The military was gutted, territory was carved away, and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley was under foreign occupation. In Berlin's government halls, officials faced an impossible equation. They had to pay massive reparations to the Allies, fund their own recovery, support millions of unemployed veterans, and somehow keep their new democracy from collapsing under the weight of popular rage. Traditional solutions, raising taxes or cutting spending, were political suicide. The German people had already sacrificed everything in 4 years of total war. They had nothing left to give. So the government turned to what seemed like a magic solution, the printing press. We'll print what we need temporarily, officials reasoned. Once we stabilize, once the economy recovers, we'll fix this. It was a decision that would unleash economic hell on earth. But in 1919, as those first new marks rolled off the presses, nobody could imagine the monster they were creating. The early signs were subtle. Prices rising gradually, nothing too alarming. Just a temporary measure, they told themselves. They were so very, very wrong. At first, printing money seemed like genius. The German economy, surprisingly, began to show signs of life in 1919 and 1920. Unemployment dropped as the government spent freshly printed marks on public works projects. Factories hummed back to life, producing goods for export. German industrialists were ecstatic. Their products became incredibly competitive in international markets as the mark weakened. Foreign buyers flocked to Germany for bargain-price goods. The printing press, one economist noted, had become Germany's most valuable export tool. But beneath this apparent prosperity, something sinister was stirring. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, had transformed into a monetary monster. Where once they'd carefully control the money supply, Now printing presses ran day and night. The sound of machinery churning out fresh currency became the heartbeat of the German economy. Dr. Rudolf Havenstein, the Reichsbank president, genuinely believed he was saving Germany. In his mind, the choice was simple: print money to keep the economy running, or watch the nation collapse into unemployment and revolution. "We are not printing money to cause inflation," he declared. "We are printing money because we have inflation." It was circular logic that would prove catastrophic. By 1921, the first cracks appeared. Bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 now cost 4 marks. Milk doubled, then tripled in price. Workers began grumbling about wages that bought less each month. But the government was trapped. Reparation payments continued to drain foreign currency reserves. The economy had become addicted to the stimulus of fresh money. Any attempt to slow the printing would trigger immediate recession and political upheaval. So they printed more, and more, and more. The psychology was intoxicating. "This is temporary," officials repeated like a mantra. "Once we negotiate better reparation terms, once the economy truly recovers, we'll restore stability." They were like addicts convincing themselves that just one more hit would solve everything. International observers began sounding alarms. British economists warned of impending disaster. American financiers shook their heads at German monetary policy. But inside Germany, many still believed they could control the beast they'd unleashed. By late 1921, that illusion was shattered. Inflation had evolved from a manageable problem into a ravaging force. Prices weren't just rising. They were accelerating upward at terrifying speed. The money machine had turned on, and nobody knew how to turn it off. January 1922. A German worker named Hans Müller received his weekly wages, 500 marks. By December of that same year, his wages had risen to 200,000 marks. You should have been celebrating, right? Wrong. That 200,000 marks bought less than his original 500 marks had 11 months earlier. This wasn't inflation anymore. This was hyperinflation, a monetary cancer that consumed everything in its path. Picture daily life in this economic hellscape. Workers didn't receive weekly or monthly paychecks. They were paid twice daily, at lunch and at closing time. Why? Because money lost value by the hour. A mark held in the morning was worth measurably less by evening. The moment wages were distributed, workers would literally run from their factories to the nearest stores. Not walk, run. Every minute of delay meant their purchasing power evaporated. Wives would wait outside factory gates to grab their husbands' wages and sprint to markets before prices jumped again. Stores became war zones. Merchants would close shop midday to reprice their entire inventory. A coat priced at 1,000 marks in the morning might cost 1,200 marks after lunch and 1,500 marks by evening. Smart shoppers learned to buy anything of value immediately, regardless of whether they needed it, because waiting meant financial suicide. The government solution? Print larger denominations. 1-mark notes became 10-mark notes, then 100, then 1,000. By 1923, Germany was printing 100 trillion mark notes. The printing presses literally couldn't keep up with the demand for higher denominations. Banks hired entire teams of workers just to count money. A simple transaction required stacks of notes, so large they were measured by weight, not count. Wheelbarrows became the standard tool for carrying cash. Some people used laundry baskets. Children discovered that money made excellent toys. Stacks of worthless marks became building blocks. Creative kids folded banknotes into paper airplanes and kites. Parents lit their stoves with currency because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The social fabric began tearing apart. Restaurant diners would finish their meals only to discover that prices had risen during their dinner. The cost of their food was higher than when they'd ordered it. Hotels demanded payment in advance, and then demanded additional payment if guests stayed past checkout time because room rates had increased. Savings accounts became cruel jokes. A middle-class family's life savings, enough to buy a house in 1921, couldn't purchase a loaf of bread by 1923. Elderly Germans who'd saved for retirement watched their entire life's work vanish in months. Desperate people turned to barter systems. Cigarettes became currency. A single egg might trade for millions of marks. Farmers refused to sell their crops for German currency, demanding gold, silver, or foreign money instead. International currencies became precious commodities. A single US dollar could buy astronomical amounts of German marks. American tourists became accidental millionaires, able to purchase entire businesses with pocket change. But perhaps most tragically, trust, the invisible foundation upon which all money depends, was dying. People stopped believing that marks had any value at all. And when people stop believing in money, money stops being money. The beast they'd unleashed in 1919 was now devouring the entire nation. In the chaos of hyperinflation, German society split into stark categories: those who understood the game and those who didn't. The divide wasn't just about wealth, it was about survival. The losers were heartbreaking to witness. Middle-class families, the backbone of German society, were obliterated overnight. These were teachers, clerks, small business owners, and civil servants who'd played by the rules, saved diligently, and believed in the promise of steady, honest work. Frau Elisabeth Hoffmann, a widow living in Munich, had saved 100,000 marks from her late husband's life insurance policy in 1920, enough to live comfortably for years. By October 1923, her entire savings could buy 3 cups of coffee. She went from financial security to destitution without spending a single mark frivolously. Pensioners faced the cruelest fate of all. These elderly Germans had worked their entire lives under the promise that their government pensions would provide dignity in old age. Now, their monthly payments couldn't buy a single meal. Proud grandparents who'd once spoiled their grandchildren were reduced to begging for scraps. University professors, once respected pillars of society, earned wages that couldn't cover basic necessities. Students stopped attending classes, not from laziness, but because their families needed them to work just to afford food. Germany's intellectual class was being systematically destroyed. But while the honest middle class suffered, others thrived in the chaos. Hugo Stinnes, a German industrialist, became one of the world's richest men during hyperinflation. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He borrowed enormous amounts of German marks, used them to buy real assets, factories, mines, ships, and then repaid his loans with worthless currency. In hyperinflation, debtors become kings because they pay back loans with money worth a fraction of what they borrowed. Foreign speculators poured into Germany like vultures. French industrialists bought German factories for the equivalent of a fancy dinner in Paris. American investors acquired entire German businesses with pocket change. The nation's industrial heritage was sold off at fire sale prices to foreign buyers. Some Germans learned to game the system. Those quick enough to understand the rules converted their marks to foreign currency, gold, or real estate as soon as they received payment. These survivors didn't get rich, but they didn't starve either. Farmers initially prospered because people always need food, but even they eventually suffered as the economy collapsed around them. What good is being paid in worthless money, even if it's enormous amounts of worthless money? Perhaps most sinister were the profiteers, Germans who actively manipulated the crisis for personal gain. These speculators would hoard goods, artificially driving up prices, then sell them for astronomical profits. They became wealthy while their neighbors starved. The social resentment was explosive. Middle-class Germans watched foreign investors buy their nation's treasures for pennies while they lost everything. Working-class families saw speculators getting rich while honest people suffered. This wasn't just economic inequality, it was a systematic destruction of social trust. The social contract that held German society together was disintegrating. People began to believe that the system was rigged, that honest work was futile, that only criminals and foreigners prospered. These bitter seeds of resentment would soon find a very dangerous gardener. November 15th, 1923. A single US dollar could buy 4.2 trillion German marks. Let that number sink in. 4,200,000,000,000 marks for $1. The German currency hadn't just collapsed. It had ceased to exist as a functioning medium of exchange. Stores refused to accept marks at any price. Workers rejected wages paid in German currency. International trade ground to a complete halt because no foreign buyer would touch German money. The government faced a terrifying reality. They had destroyed their own currency so thoroughly that it could never be repaired. No amount of promises, no government guarantee, no policy change could restore faith in the German mark. It was monetary death, pure and simple. But paradoxically, this complete destruction opened the door to salvation. On November 20th, 1923, the German government announced a monetary revolution. They were killing the mark entirely and replacing it with a new currency, the Rentenmark. But this wasn't just another name change. This was a complete philosophical shift. Unlike the old marks, which were backed by nothing but government promises, the Rentenmark was backed by something real: German land and industrial assets. Every new mark was theoretically redeemable for a specific amount of German real estate and productive capacity. The exchange rate was simple and brutal: 1 Rentenmark for 1 trillion old marks. Overnight, Germany's currency supply shrunk by a factor of 1 trillion. Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, the new central bank president, made an even more radical promise. The government would stop printing money to fund operations. No more financing government spending with fresh currency. No more using the printing press as a magic solution to financial problems. International support proved crucial. The Dawes Plan, backed by American loans and international guarantees, restructured Germany's reparation payments into manageable amounts. Foreign investors, sensing opportunity, began providing capital in exchange for real assets rather than promises. But the most important change was psychological. Hans Schacht understood that money is fundamentally about trust. People had to believe that the new currency would hold its value. So he did something unprecedented. He made the new money artificially scarce. Unlike the hyperinflation era when money was abundant but worthless, Schacht made Rentenmarks difficult to obtain. Banks couldn't lend freely. The government couldn't spend beyond its means. Credit became tight, business failures increased, unemployment rose, but people began to trust the currency again. It was a brutal but necessary treatment. Like a doctor amputating a gangrenous limb to save the patient, Germany had to destroy its monetary system to rebuild it. The results were almost miraculous. Within months, prices stabilized. Workers stopped rushing from their jobs to spend wages immediately. Stores began accepting German currency again. International trade resumed. But the scars ran deep. An entire generation of Germans had learned that their government could not be trusted with money. They'd watched their savings vanish, their futures destroyed, their society nearly collapse, all because politicians had chosen the easy path of printing money rather than making hard choices. The Weimar Republic had survived its monetary crisis, but the political and social damage was irreversible. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to fully restore. The hyperinflation was over, but its ghost would haunt Germany forever. What emerged from the ashes of the great monetary collapse was a nation fundamentally changed, scarred, cynical, and vulnerable to extremist promises. The social devastation was staggering. Germany's middle class, the educated, stable backbone of any democratic society, had been systematically destroyed. Teachers, civil servants, small business owners, and skilled workers had seen their life savings evaporate and their social status collapse. These weren't just economic statistics. These were the very people who had believed most strongly in law, order, and democratic institutions. In their place rose a new social dynamic. On one side were the foreign investors and German speculators who had profited from the chaos, often viewed as parasites who had grown rich from national suffering. On the other side were millions of impoverished, embittered Germans who had lost everything despite following the rules. This social resentment created fertile ground for radical politics. When people lose faith in economic systems, they become desperate for someone to blame and someone to save them. Enter Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In 1920, Hitler was a fringe agitator speaking to tiny crowds in Munich beer halls. By 1924, he was leading a political movement that nearly seized control of Bavaria. What changed? The hyperinflation had created millions of Germans ready to listen to extremist solutions. Hitler's message was perfectly crafted for hyperinflation survivors. The current system is corrupt and broken. Foreign enemies and internal traitors have robbed you of your birthright. Only radical action can restore Germany's greatness. To people who had watched wheelbarrows full of money become worthless, these promises resonated powerfully. The Nazi propaganda explicitly referenced the hyperinflation trauma. They stole your savings, Hitler declared at rallies. They destroyed your future. They made your life's work worthless paper. This wasn't abstract political theory. This was recent, painful memory for millions of Germans. Even after the immediate crisis passed, the psychological damage persisted. Germans who lived through hyperinflation never fully trusted paper money again. They hoarded gold, foreign currency, and physical goods. They became suspicious of government promises and skeptical of economic experts who claimed to understand monetary policy. This trauma created a paradox that would shape German political culture for generations. Germans simultaneously demanded both economic stability and strong government action to prevent future monetary disasters. They wanted security, even if it came at the cost of freedom. The international community also learned dangerous lessons. The hyperinflation demonstrated that modern economies could collapse with terrifying speed. It showed that monetary policy was a weapon that could destroy nations more effectively than armies. And it proved that economic chaos could quickly transform into political extremism. Perhaps most ominously, the hyperinflation established a template that would be repeated throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. When governments face impossible fiscal pressures, whether from war, debt, or economic crisis, the printing press always beckons as a seemingly easy solution. We've seen this story replay in Hungary after World War II, in Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe, in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, and in Argentina repeatedly. Each time, the initial logic seems sound. Print money to solve immediate problems, worry about consequences later. But Weimar Germany taught us the ultimate lesson. There are no monetary miracles, only monetary reckonings. Every mark printed without real economic backing eventually comes due. And when it does, the price is always higher than anyone imagined. The ghosts of wheelbarrows full of worthless money still haunt us today. As we step back from the ashes of Weimar Germany, a chilling question emerges. Could it happen again? Could our modern, sophisticated economies fall victim to the same monetary madness that destroyed Germany nearly a century ago? The uncomfortable truth is that the conditions that created Weimar hyperinflation exist in various forms around the world today. Consider the global debt levels. In 2023, total global debt reached an unprecedented $307 trillion, roughly 336% of global economic output. Government debt in major economies has exploded. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 250%, Italy's approaches 150%, and the United States carries over $33 trillion in federal debt. Just like Weimar Germany, modern governments face politically impossible choices. Raising taxes enough to pay down debt would trigger economic recession and political suicide. Cutting spending sufficiently would eliminate popular programs and cause social unrest. So what do? They turn to the same magic solution that seduced German officials a century ago: monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from $900 billion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion by 2021, a tenfold increase. The European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and other major central banks followed similar paths. This isn't hyperinflation, but it's the same fundamental playbook: create money to solve fiscal problems. Modern economists insist this is different from Weimar. They point to sophisticated monetary tools, international coordination, and better understanding of inflation dynamics. We've learned from history, they claim. We can control this. But this confidence sounds eerily familiar to anyone who studies Weimar. Dr. Havenstein also believed he could control monetary expansion. He also thought he understood the dynamics of inflation. He also insisted that his situation was unique and that historical precedents didn't apply. Venezuela provides a sobering contemporary example. In 2013, Venezuela was a relatively prosperous oil-rich nation. President Nicolas Maduro faced fiscal pressures and turned to monetary expansion to fund social programs and maintain political support. Venezuelan economists warned of inflation risks, but Maduro's government insisted they could manage the process. By 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate exceeded 1,000,000% annually. Children in Caracas literally played with stacks of worthless bolivars, just like German children had played with marks a century earlier. Venezuelan professionals fled the country, their life savings destroyed. The parallels to Weimar are unmistakable. Even more concerning are the psychological parallels. Modern populations like 1920s Germans have lost faith in traditional institutions. Trust in government, media, and expert opinion has plummeted across Western democracies. Social inequality has created the same toxic resentment that poisoned Weimar Germany. When monetary crises strike populations that already distrust their institutions, the results are predictably dangerous. We're seeing the rise of extremist political movements across the globe, each promising to restore economic security through radical action. The digital age adds new complexities. Modern financial systems are more interconnected and move at light speed. A monetary crisis that took months to develop in 1923 Germany could unfold in hours today. High-frequency trading, global derivatives markets, and digital currencies create potential for economic chaos that dwarfs anything Weimar Germans experienced. Perhaps most alarmingly, modern governments possess monetary tools that 1920s Germany couldn't imagine. Negative interest rates, quantitative easing, modern monetary theory. These sophisticated-sounding policies are ultimately variations on the same theme, creating money to solve economic problems. The fundamental lesson of Weimar remains unchanged. Money is trust, and trust, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to restore. No amount of technical sophistication can overcome the basic human psychology that underlies all monetary systems. Are we immune to Weimar's fate? History suggests we're not. As wheelbarrows full of worthless money disappeared from German streets in 1924, what remained was a lesson so profound it should be carved into the stone of every central bank. Money is nothing more than organized trust, and trust is the most fragile force in human civilization. Think about the money in your wallet right now. Those bills have no intrinsic value. They're not backed by gold, silver, or any physical commodity. They're valuable only because everyone agrees they're valuable. The moment that collective agreement breaks, the moment people stop believing, those bills become colored paper. This is what the German people learned in the most painful way possible. One day, their marks bought bread. The next day, they were suitable only for wallpaper. Nothing had fundamentally changed about the physical bills themselves. What changed was belief. The Weimar hyperinflation revealed the awesome, terrifying power of collective psychology. Millions of people simultaneously lost faith in their money. And that loss of faith became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Money became worthless because people believed it was worthless, and people believed it was worthless because it was becoming worthless. But there's a deeper, darker lesson buried in this story. The politicians who unleashed this monetary monster weren't evil geniuses plotting Germany's destruction. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary pressures, making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. In 1919, printing money to pay reparations seemed like the only alternative to national bankruptcy. In 1920, continuing to print money seemed necessary to avoid economic collapse. By 1921, they were trapped in a system of their own making, unable to stop without triggering immediate disaster. This is the true horror of the Weimar story. It shows how rational people making individually defensible decisions can collectively create catastrophe. Each step toward hyperinflation seemed logical given the circumstances. Only in hindsight does the path to destruction appear obvious. The human cost was staggering beyond measure. Millions of lives were destroyed, not by war or natural disaster, but by monetary policy. Families lost their life savings. Children went hungry while their parents carried worthless money. Elderly people died in poverty after working their entire lives. But perhaps most tragically, the hyperinflation destroyed something even more precious than individual wealth. It shattered social trust. Germans lost faith in their institutions, their experts, their money, and ultimately in each other. This breakdown of social cohesion paved the way for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. The connection between monetary collapse and political extremism isn't coincidental, it's causal. When people's economic foundations are destroyed, they become desperate for someone to blame and someone to save them. They become willing to embrace radical solutions and surrender democratic freedoms in exchange for promises of security. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Every hyperinflation creates political instability. Every monetary collapse leads to social upheaval. The economics and politics of money are inseparable. So when modern politicians promise that money printing is safe, when economists insist they can control inflation, when experts claim this time is different, remember the German officials who made identical promises a century ago. Remember the wheelbarrows full of worthless money. Remember the children playing with bundled banknotes. Remember the middle-class families who lost everything. Remember how a proud, educated, civilized nation descended into economic chaos and political extremism. Most importantly, remember that money is trust, and trust, once broken, may never fully heal. In the end, the story of Weimar hyperinflation isn't really about economics. It's about human nature. It's about the dangerous seduction of easy solutions, the fragility of social trust, and the terrible price we pay when monetary systems collapse. The German mark died, not from external attack, but from internal betrayal. Politicians chose the printing press over hard choices. Experts rationalized away obvious dangers. Citizens trusted their leaders until it was too late to matter. Today, as we watch global debt levels soar, as central banks create trillions in new money, as trust in institutions crumbles around the world, the ghosts of Weimar whisper their warning. This can happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone. Money only works because people believe in it. The moment that belief is broken, paper becomes paper, and chaos follows. The question isn't whether monetary crises will happen again. The question is whether we'll recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Could something like Weimar happen in our world of trillion-dollar debts and endless money printing? Look around. The seeds are already planted. The only question is whether they'll find the right conditions to grow. The past isn't just history, it's prophecy. And Weimar Germany's prophecy should terrify us all. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden dangers lurking in our monetary system, you need to subscribe to Vaulted Wisdom right now. We're one of the few channels brave enough to tell you the financial truths that the establishment doesn't want you to know. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're diving deep into the stories that reveal how the world really works. From forgotten financial disasters to the hidden mechanisms of power, we're building the most important library of knowledge on YouTube. And here's what I want you to do next. Share this video. Share it with your friends, your family, your colleagues. Share it with anyone who thinks our current monetary system is safe and stable. Because the lessons of Weimar Germany are too important to ignore and too dangerous to forget. The wheelbarrows full of worthless money are a warning from history. The question is, will we listen before it's too late? Until next time, keep seeking the truth. This is Vaulted Wisdom, where forbidden knowledge becomes your power.